If your power went out tonight and stayed off for 48 hours, most people wouldn't be uncomfortable. They would be unprepared in ways they don't realize until the first hour passes. You walk into your home, flip the switch out of habit, and nothing happens. No light, no sound of systems kicking in, just silence that feels heavier than expected. At first, you wait a few minutes, assuming it's temporary. Then you realize the refrigerator isn't running. The internet is gone. The house slowly stops behaving like a system and starts behaving like a structure that's no longer supported. That moment of realization is not dramatic. It's quiet. And that's exactly what makes it worse. Because the real question isn't how often blackouts happen. It's how long your home can actually function when everything you rely on stops at the same time. Most people never test that question until it's already happening. And by then, you don't get time to prepare. You only get time to react. Most people assume that if their home struggles during a blackout, it's just bad luck or poor preparation on their part. But that assumption misses something important about how modern households are built. Homes today are not independent systems. They are fully dependent nodes connected to a larger grid that is constantly balancing demand, infrastructure limits, and environmental pressure in real time. When that external system drops out, the home doesn't gradually reduce function. It collapses in layers. First comfort systems, then communication, then food storage, then temperature control. And what makes this worse is that none of it is designed to degrade gracefully. Over the last 2 decades, grid reliability has improved in some areas, but demand complexity has increased even faster. Extreme weather events, regional consumption spikes, and infrastructure aging all contribute to instability that most households never see coming until they experience it directly. Call it what it is, a dependency structure that looks stable until it isn't. And I've spent enough time studying residential energy behavior to notice a pattern most people don't talk about. It's not that homes are unprepared. It's that they are optimized for a condition that no longer exists consistently. Now imagine a normal evening. Dinner is being prepared. Lights are on. Appliances are running in the background without anyone thinking about them. Nothing feels unusual. Then the power drops. At first, it feels like a temporary inconvenience. You check your phone. Maybe assume it's localized. But as minutes pass, the realization sets in that the entire area is affected. And this is where most people make a mistake that costs them the next several hours of stability. They wait. What nobody tells you about grid failures is that the first hour determines most of the outcome inside the home. Refrigeration begins to lose efficiency. Communication becomes uncertain. Small routines that normally feel automatic start requiring active problem solving. And internally, most people land on the same thought without saying it out loud. I should have been more prepared for this. Now shift the scenario. It's not a short outage. It extends longer than expected. Food storage becomes a real concern. Not immediately, but progressively. You start opening the refrigerator less. Not because you're told to, but because you're trying to preserve what's inside. Lighting becomes dependent on whatever backup sources you can find. And the part that surprises most people is not the inconvenience. It's how quickly normal routines disappear without replacement. There's a specific mental shift that happens here. You stop thinking in hours. You start thinking in constraints. How long will this last? What still works? What can be delayed? And underneath all of that, another quiet conclusion forms. I must be missing something simple here. Now at a third layer, a seasonal event, extreme heat or cold. When the grid is already under stress, homes are no longer just without power. They are exposed to environmental conditions they normally don't have to actively manage. Temperature regulation stops being automatic. It becomes manual, limited, and inconsistent. And this is where frustration turns inward. Not because anything changed inside the home, but because everything outside the home stopped supporting it. And here's what all 3 of these situations have in common. They don't start with failure inside the household. They start with external system instability being transferred directly into the home. That transfer is invisible until it isn't. After enough situations like this, the question stops being, how do I get through an outage, and becomes something more structural. What actually supports a home when the external system is not available? That question leads into a different way of thinking about energy inside residential spaces. Instead of treating electricity as something purely consumed from an external grid, some approaches look at buffering and stabilizing energy access through local systems that reduce dependency on real-time external fluctuations, not as replacement, not as elimination, but as stabilization. The principle is simple. When external supply becomes variable, internal consistency becomes more valuable than peak performance. Early attempts at this concept were not practical, too complex, too dependent on conditions that didn't scale to normal households. But simplified approaches began focusing on accessibility rather than optimization, systems designed to reduce volatility rather than maximize output. And what mattered most in real-world cases wasn't the theoretical performance. It was whether daily life became less sensitive to external disruption. In those cases, the change was not dramatic in appearance. It was structural in effect, less uncertainty, more predictability in how the home responded over time. One of the most consistent objections to this type of thinking is that it assumes too much technical ability or infrastructure availability inside a normal household, and that concern is valid when discussing complex systems. But simplified models change the conversation entirely. In observed cases, households with no technical background were able to engage with the concept at a functional level because the focus was not on engineering complexity, but on step-by-step implementation and reduction of external dependency. In one case, a household dealing with seasonal instability reported that the most noticeable change was not savings magnitude, but consistency across months where previously costs fluctuated heavily. Another household focused less on financial outcomes and more on operational stability during periods of grid stress. Different contexts, same principal outcome. Reduced exposure to external volatility. If nothing changes, the next several months will likely follow a familiar pattern. Small fluctuations in energy reliability. Occasional disruptions tied to external conditions. Gradual adjustment of what is considered normal household stability. Not catastrophic, just increasingly variable. But if even a partial buffer exists between the home and those external fluctuations, the experience shifts. Not because everything becomes independent, but because unpredictability becomes less dominant in daily planning. And when unpredictability decreases, decision-making inside the home becomes simpler and more stable. Looking at it in hindsight, most households don't struggle because they lack effort or attention. They struggle because they are responding to a system that no longer behaves consistently enough to optimize in a traditional way. Once that is understood, the focus shifts away from control and towards stability. And from that perspective, the question becomes less about reacting to outages and more about how much dependency you want your home to carry before the next one happens.